winter mud. He thought grief had finally learned how to take shape. The child could not have been more than 9. He stood barefoot beside a broken fence outside the village bakehouse, thin as a reed, coat too small across his shoulders, one hand wrapped around a crust of bread he had likely been saving for someone else. Snowmelt had turned the road into brown slush. Smoke from low chimneys dragged itself across the air. Women with baskets hurried past with their eyes lowered, because poor villages teach people not to stare too long at any suffering that resembles their own. Yet this boy stopped and stared directly at Gideon. Not boldly, not rudely, with the grave confusion of a child who has suddenly found a face from his own house, walking where no such face should exist. In 1784, Virginia was full of ruined fields, thin credit, widows with empty larders, and villages that had been asked to cheer liberty while still learning how to survive it. The war was over. Debt, hunger, and old family power were not. Poverty after peace carried a bitterness different from wartime want. During war, men could call suffering sacrifice. After peace, it was only what remained. He drew rein near the bakehouse because the wheel of the supply wagon behind him had come loose in the ruts, and because the sight of the child had struck somewhere too deep for immediate naming. The boy's hair was dark chestnut, his jaw still soft with youth, his cheeks hollow from lean winters, but the shape of his eyes, the line of his brow, the slight, stubborn set of his mouth, even in silence, those belonged to Gideon as surely as the scar that crossed his own left hand. Then the child shifted the bread to his other arm, and the frayed sleeve of his shirt slid back. There, above the wrist, lay a pale, crescent birthmark. Gideon went cold beneath his coat. It was the same mark he had carried since infancy. For a moment the road disappeared. He saw instead a lantern-lit orchard 14 years earlier. A girl with loosened hair and a ribbon at her throat, standing half-hidden behind summer leaves, while music from the assembly rooms drifted faintly across the fields. The daughter of a tenant carpenter, too intelligent to be meek, too gentle to be hard, too poor to be safely loved by the heir to Ashdown Hall. "Sir?" the boy said at last. His voice broke the memory apart. Gideon dismounted so quickly his boot slipped in the mud. "What is your name?" he asked. The boy hesitated. Hunger teaches caution before honesty. "Alfred Bell, sir." The surname hit him almost as hard as the face had. Bell. Eliza had always said she preferred the plain strength of her own family name to any grander one. "A bell rings clear," she had once told him, laughing at his embroidered cuffs after a dance. "Hart men like to think everything important must arrive on horseback." He swallowed. "And your mother?" Alfred looked toward the bakehouse door. "She is not well, sir." "Her name?" The boy's thin hand tightened on the bread. "Mrs. Elsie Gray." Not Bell, not Eliza. Gideon did not realize he had crouched to the child's level until icy mud had soaked through the knee of his breeches. "Does your mother live here?" he asked. Alfred nodded. "In the mill cottage beyond the willow ditch." One of Gideon's men called from the wagon behind him, asking whether they should press on to Warrenton before dark. Gideon did not turn. He was 36, master of Ashdown Hall in Prince William County, a veteran of a war that had returned him with a damaged shoulder, a colder manner, and the conviction that everything soft in him had gone into the grave with Eliza Bell. He had buried her there himself, or thought he had. If stories of hidden heirs, buried scandals, and elegant reckonings are the kind you stay for, like this video and subscribe to Quiet Fires of America, where the truth rarely arrives early, but it always arrives with interest. 14 years earlier, a carriage bound from Fredericksburg had overturned in a storm on the Lower River Road. One body had been found in the flooded ditch, the face ruined, the papers gone, the clothing enough for certainty in a county ready to believe the worst. Eliza vanished the same week after Gideon's uncle Ambrose warned him that loving a carpenter's daughter would ruin the Hart family's prospects. Gideon had been 22, still half under his father's authority and vain enough to believe private defiance was the same thing as power. He had not yet learned how thoroughly old houses could arrange a lie when reputation required it. By the time he reached the site, rain and river had done their work. By the time he demanded answers, the burial was already over. Now a boy with his face stood barefoot before him in winter mud. He nearly asked to be taken straight to the boy's mother. Instead, he stopped himself. Grief had once already taught him what happens when a desperate man turns resemblance into certainty. So he rose, forced his voice back under control, and asked only the questions that would remain useful later. "How old are you?" "9, sir, nearly 10. "And your mother has always been Mrs. Gray?" Alfred frowned, as if the answer had edges he did not trust. "As long as I have known her." "Does she receive visitors?" "No, sir." That answer carried more weariness than impertinence. Gideon looked once toward the willow ditch the boy had named, toward the cottage roof just visible beyond the reeds, and understood with a force bordering on pain that if he stepped into that house now, he would go in wanting a dead woman to rise merely because her shadow had fallen across a child's face. He could not afford that kind of hope yet. "Very well," he said. The disappointment on Alfred's face was so brief and guarded, Gideon almost missed it. For one reckless second, he nearly changed his mind, nearly asked to be taken there anyway, nearly chose pain over caution. He reached into his coat, hesitated, then drew out a small wrapped heel of travel cake from his saddle pouch and held it toward the boy. "For your mother," he said, making the lie kind enough to preserve the child's dignity. Alfred took it after a pause. "Thank you, sir." Gideon mounted again and rode on before he could disgrace himself by turning back. That evening at Ashdown, he did what powerful men do when they are afraid to trust their own longing. He set other people to work in its place. He sent his most reliable groom, Martin Vale, to the village with money, patience, and strict instructions to ask after the widow called Elsie Gray without attaching Gideon Hart's name to the inquiry. He sent the steward to search old coach-house copies for records that might have survived the missing page. He wrote to St. Luke's for Bell family notices and to Fredericksburg for any remaining mention of the wreck year. Before dawn, he had also opened the locked drawer where he kept the few objects from his youth he had never been able to throw away. At the bottom lay a faded length of green ribbon, one summer letter in Eliza's hand, and the mate to a silver ring set long ago with a pale river pearl. He had commissioned the pair from a Williamsburg smith who believed they were sibling trinkets, one for her, one for him. Eliza had laughed when he chose the pearl instead of a brighter stone, saying river things endured by quietness. He had loved her for saying it, a foolish lover's device meant to be private and therefore imagined safe. By the next afternoon, Martin returned with more than gossip. The boy, Alfred Bell, was known to the bakehouse widow as a decent child who never stole and never ate before carrying some portion home. His mother had indeed been found years earlier after the Lower Road wreck, already with child. She kept no husband's name, spoke rarely of the past, and once, in fever, had cried for someone named Gid. No more than that, but enough to leave a mark on those who heard it. There was also an old seamstress in the village who remembered mending one finer garment from the found bundle years ago, a cloak lined in blue silk uncommon in poor cottages. Eliza had owned such a cloak. Still, Gideon forced himself not to call it proof. He returned to the village on the second morning with no wagon train, no servants in livery, and only one plain horse, so as not to crowd their poverty with his rank. He brought broth, firewood, oranges from the house stores, and a physician's draft under the modest pretense that Ashdown assisted distressed tenants more often than people believed. This time Alfred opened the door without fear, only wary curiosity. "Mother said you might come back," he admitted. "Did she?" "She said your face troubled the room after you left." Inside, everything was swept, patched, and carefully arranged in the terrible neatness of people too poor to waste even disorder. Elsie Gray sat propped up on the narrow bed by the window with a shawl around her shoulders. The color in her face was still fragile, but she seemed more awake. On the table beside her lay a small wooden workbox, a heap of mending, and, half hidden beneath folded cloth, a silver chain, from which something had been tied with thread after being broken. At first, Gideon let himself look only at the room, then at her hands, then, despite all discipline, at her face. Her eyes were still Eliza's, not because they were unchanged, they were not. The bright, quick humor he had once loved had been dimmed by pain, and something like bewildered vigilance lived behind it now, as if the world had spent years arriving in pieces she could never quite sort into sense. Yet the eyes were hers. She looked at Gideon with no sign of recognition at all, only polite alarm shadowed by effort. "Sir," she said, trying to sit straighter, "you are kind to return, but we have nothing with which to repay charity." The sound of her voice, after 14 years, nearly undid him. "Mrs. Gray," Gideon said, because he did not yet trust himself with any other name. "I did not come to collect anything." A faint crease touched her brow. "I have seen you." "No," Alfred said quietly from the hearth. "You said perhaps in a dream." She touched her temple. "Perhaps." Gideon's heart beat harder. "Do you often have such dreams?" A silence passed before she answered. "I have many fragments, sir. They do not behave." The phrase was so unlike the Eliza he had known, and yet so piercingly hers in its plain intelligence, that he had to look away. Then he saw the chain. The ring attached to it had lost its pearl exactly as the village midwife had described. But the engraved inner band remained. Not a motto, not initials, only the tiny cut mark the smith had made beneath the setting when Gideon, young and absurdly earnest, asked him to scratch a secret sign into both rings so they would belong to one pair and no other. Elsie followed his gaze, then reached for the ring as if protecting it by instinct rather than memory. "Where did you get that?" he asked. A strange expression moved over her face. "It was tied into the lining of my cloak when they found me. I do not know why I have never thrown it away." Her fingers closed around it. "But whenever I touched it, I felt I was being asked to remember someone who had once looked at me as if I were not small." That was the moment certainty finally arrived. Not in the birthmark alone, not in Alfred's face, not in the wreck, or the timing, or the whispered fragments. In the ring, in the hidden engraving, in the private promise no one else should have known existed. Gideon sat down because standing had suddenly become impossible. "It was mine to give," he said quietly, "and yours to keep." Her eyes widened, not with full recognition yet, but with the first true terror of a locked room beginning to open in the mind. "Who are you?" she whispered. He held her gaze and, for the first time, gave her the answer in full. "I am Gideon Hart," he said. "And if that ring is with you, then you are not Elsie Gray by origin. You are Eliza Bell. Alfred is your son. And unless God has chosen a cruelty too exact for any human plotting, he is mine as well." The child went still between them. No one spoke for several breaths. Alfred looked first at Gideon, then at his mother, as if waiting for one of them to deny what the room had already accepted. Gideon heard his own words hanging between them and understood almost too late that he had just spoken aloud the life he had spent 14 years burying. Then Eliza pressed the heel of her hand to her brow as if the skull itself had become too small for what was inside it. "I know that name," she said. "I know it as pain. I know it as summer. I know it as something taken away before I could hold it." Only then did the village midwife, who had been fetching water from the back shed, complete the outline Gideon had already begun to fear. Mrs. Gray had indeed been found years earlier after the carriage wreck on the lower road, half-drowned, bruised, fevered, and stripped of useful memory, with only the scorched scrap naming Elsie and the broken ring hidden in her cloak. She had lived since by sewing, washing, mending, and raising the child she knew was hers but could never fully explain. Some days she remembered enough to become frightened by her own mind. Other days she remembered almost nothing and worked as if labor itself might keep the missing pieces from haunting her. "Who brought her in?" Gideon asked. "A carter who feared trouble and left before morning," the midwife answered. She gave the name when pressed, and Gideon recognized the family line at once. Men who had long hauled tobacco for his uncle's warehouses. That was when suspicion ceased to be grief's delirium and hardened into structure. His uncle had arranged it. Not merely the separation, the entire burial, the false certainty, the silence that followed. Ambrose Hart had always been the house's colder intelligence. Gideon's father had carried the family name. Ambrose had protected its edges. He understood debts, marriage settlements, county rumors, and the uses of respectable fear. He had once told Gideon that affection is harmless in private and ruinous in public when directed beneath one's station. At the time, Gideon had despised him for the sentence's elegance. He despised him more now for the machinery behind it. Gideon leaned forward, every instinct in him begging to close the distance, yet keeping himself still. "Then let me earn the right to explain this, not all at once, not like another man deciding your life over your head." This time, when he asked them to come to Ashdown, he did not ask from suspicion. He asked from truth. And after a long silence, with Alfred's hand in hers and the broken ring still warm in her palm, Eliza said yes. That night, Gideon sent the carriage back toward Ashdown Hall with blankets, broth, firewood, the physician's draft, and a surgeon waiting by the east wing before midnight. Ashdown had never seemed to him more like a theater built for lies. The red brick house, the winter hedges, the portraits of dead hearts along the stair, all of it now looked less dignified than upholstered in selective memory. He settled Eliza and Alfred in the West guest suite, rather than in any lesser wing, partly because the rooms were warmer, partly because it sent the household a message he wanted carried intact. Mrs. Harrow, the widowed housekeeper who had kept Ashdown from turning into a barracks of masculine neglect after Gideon's father died, raised only one eyebrow when she saw the guests, and then said, "I shall have hot water carried directly." Within 3 days, Alfred had discovered food enough to trust, boots that fit, and the existence of books in a nursery cabinet left from Gideon's late sister. He bore each comfort with the desperate self-command of children who suspect all gifts may yet be reclaimed. Eliza improved more slowly. The surgeon confirmed what the midwife had implied: old head trauma, recurring spells of confusion, memory gaps likely worsened by years of strain, and a body carrying the marks of long deprivation rather than one recent illness alone. Soon, fragments began to stir. It happened first when Mrs. Harrow brought up a green silk ribbon to tie back a curtain while the seamstress took measurements. Eliza saw the ribbon and pressed her fingers suddenly to her mouth. An orchard, she murmured. Gideon, who had been standing by the hearth, went still. What orchard? He asked. She turned toward him with tears already gathering in bewilderment rather than grief. Summer lanterns, music, someone saying I should not laugh so loudly because people would know I was happy. Then the memory vanished and left her shaking. Another time Alfred fell in the lower hall and scraped his wrist. Gideon knelt to help him, and Eliza, reaching at once for the boy, saw the pale crescent marks on both their arms beside each other. She stared as if the world had become visibly wrong. "Why do you have his skin?" she whispered. Gideon could not answer. In those first 2 weeks, he also began quietly to investigate. The carriage records from 14 years earlier were gone from the Hart coach house, and the stable ledger had one page cut neatly from the volume for that month. The old carter named by the midwife was dead, but his son remembered enough to confirm sealed orders from Ambrose, a storm road journey, and a command to say nothing because powerful names were involved. Gideon kept his face still while hearing this. Ambrose Hart still lived at Rosebank, 12 miles east, pretending age and gout had softened a man whose chief talent had always been arranging other people's injuries into forms society would call regrettable but necessary. Outwardly pious and meticulous in all duties, he was exactly the sort of elder gentleman magistrates still trusted. Gideon did not confront him immediately. War had cured him of youthful lunges. Instead, he set lawyers to tracing marriage settlements, inheritance implications, and baptismal records. He sent to St. Luke's Parish for every register touching Eliza Bell's family, and to Fredericksburg for any notice of the accident year. He asked no public questions yet. Quietly, he also requested that Dr. Pembroke, an older physician who had once treated soldiers for head wounds with more honesty than optimism, examine Eliza privately and note any judgment on memory loss tied to violence or shock. The house changed around them. Alfred learned the path to the kitchens, the stables, and Gideon's library, where he first touched a globe as if it were contraband. Once, while practicing letters at the escritoire, he asked with studied care, "Sir, were you always rich?" Gideon, who had just removed his gloves, answered, "No man is always anything." "That is not the same." "No," he considered. "I was born into comfort. I have not always deserved it." Alfred absorbed this as if storing it beside other useful facts. "And did you have a father?" he asked. The question landed with more irony than the child intended. "Yes," Gideon said, "though not the sort every son can use." Alfred nodded, perhaps hearing only tone, not history. Later that evening, the boy fell asleep beside the library fire with one hand curled exactly as Gideon's own had when young, and Gideon stood over him longer than he meant to. He understood then that love after bereavement does not return gently. It arrives carrying all the years stolen from it, and it asks with terrible calm, what kind of man was made by surviving without it? Eliza's memory came back as weather fronts do, uncertainly, then all at once, then gone again. She remembered the orchard before she remembered Gideon's name. She remembered the scent of polished walnut before she remembered Ashdown's front hall. She remembered fear before she remembered why. Once she woke from sleep, crying out against the rattling sound of carriage wheels on planks, then clutched at her head so violently Gideon nearly summoned the whole house in alarm. "It was dark," she said afterward in a voice scraped raw. "There was rain on the window and someone speaking in front. I knew I should not be in that carriage. I knew I must get down. And then," she shut her eyes hard. "Nothing. Only water, cold, a face bending over mine that was not yours." Not yours. The words should have comforted him. Instead, they reminded him how much of her suffering had occurred in the blank country between what he imagined and what had actually happened. One afternoon, she found him in the winter garden, where the dead vines had been cut back and the glass panes trembled under March wind. "I know your hand," she said without preamble. He looked up from the shears he had not truly been using. "My hand?" She came nearer, studying the scar across it. "You reached for me over a gate once and caught the iron latch." The memory struck with such force that he had to brace himself against the stone ledge. He had been 19, she 17, laughing after dark because her father would have locked the yard if he had known Gideon Hart was foolish enough to climb it. "Eliza," he said. At the name, something flared in her face. Then pain followed. "I was Eliza," she whispered. "Yes." She swayed. He caught her by the arms. For one suspended second, they stood close enough for the whole lost past to breathe between them. Then she began to weep with the devastated restraint of a woman whose life has been returned to her in torn pieces and expects gratitude merely because the pieces still exist. 14 years, she said. What did they do to me? Gideon had no answer worthy of the wound. He only held her while the wind struck the panes and the winter garden filled with a grief too old for drama. After that, the memories accelerated. She remembered Ambrose's servant bringing word that Gideon had sent for her in secrecy because his father had agreed at last to a private meeting before formal acknowledgement. She remembered believing it, because love at 20 believes what it most needs to. She remembered entering the carriage alone. She remembered not one servant, but two, and one of them not from Ashdown at all. She remembered asking where Gideon was. She remembered the answer, delayed, right on. She remembered unease becoming fear. She remembered trying the latch and finding it held. After that came storm, speed, a jolt, shouting, pain, water, dark. No memory yet bridged the years between rescue and village life, but what had been done was already clear enough. Ambrose had staged the removal, and likely the accident itself or the conditions leading to it. Whether he had meant death or only disappearance no longer mattered much to Gideon. Both were forms of murder where the old life was concerned. The inheritance implications became clear almost simultaneously. If Eliza had lived, and if Alfred was born within months of the abduction, then the child's paternity and status touched not merely scandal, but property. Gideon had never married. His father and uncle had spent years pressing him toward suitable alliances, then, later, toward designated collateral arrangements that would keep Ashdown in reliable hands if he died childless. Since the war, several cousins and creditors had circled his estate like polite carrion. A lawful, acknowledged son would alter every expectation in the county. That was precisely why Ambrose had acted, not only to preserve family pride, but to preserve control. When Gideon finally rode to Rosebank, spring had begun to soften the roads, but not his resolve. Ambrose received him in the front parlor with a shawl over his knees, a silver-headed cane beside his chair, and an expression of faintly injured affection, as though nephews who visit without notice are the true disorder in this world. "My dear Gideon," he said, "you look as if the Republic has again disappointed you." "It usually does." Gideon remained standing. "So did you." Ambrose's brows lifted. "How grave." "I have found Eliza Bell." The old man did not drop his teacup. He did not gasp. He only paused long enough to reveal that he had understood the name instantly. Then he set the cup down. "Have you?" The calmness confirmed more than any confession might have. "She is alive." "How remarkable." "And my son with her." This time the pause lengthened. Ambrose folded his hands over the shawl. I wondered whether the child had survived. Gideon could have struck him dead with less effort than it took not to. You arranged it, he said. Ambrose sighed, as if obliged to explain arithmetic to an excitable student. I arranged necessity. Call it by its name. I call it the burden younger men never understand until the bill is laid before them. Your father's debts were widening. Your attachment had become visible. The Bells were beneath us, however charming the girl. A marriage, or public acknowledgement, would have ruined every settlement under discussion. Creditors would have smelt weakness. Cousins would have pressed claims. Suitable alliances would have vanished. We were preserving Ashdown. You nearly killed her. Ambrose's gaze hardened with irritation rather than shame. Do not sentimentalize accident. She was to be conveyed to relatives farther west with money enough to begin quietly. The storm did what storms do. And the false burial? To end the matter cleanly. Gideon looked at him and understood all at once why some families rot without collapsing. Because the people steering them grow so practiced at translating cruelty into management that they no longer hear what they are saying. She lost 14 years, Gideon said. Her memory, her name. Our child was raised in poverty while you sat in comfort calling it preservation. Ambrose tapped 2 fingers once against the arm of his chair. And yet Ashdown remains, which is more than can be said for many estates run according to passion. The phrase settled into Gideon like a blade. For the first time in his life, he did not merely reject his uncle's morality. He saw the exact defect in himself that had once allowed men like Ambrose to act at all. He had always thought decency required him to despise the house's hardness inwardly while still protecting its outward dignity. He had mistaken refusal to become like them for resistance sufficient to stop them. It had not been enough. You will sign a statement, Gideon said, naming what you did. Ambrose gave a short, incredulous laugh. And invite county disgrace? Litigation? Questions of legitimacy no prudent magistrate will enjoy settling? My dear boy, you still speak as if truth rules anything by itself. No, but I do. Ambrose's face altered then, finally sensing the edge beneath the voice. What exactly do you imagine you can prove? Enough. Gideon stepped closer. The carter, the missing ledgers, the servant who rode ahead, the physician's testimony on head injury, her recovered memory, the timing of Alfred's birth, your own inability to sound surprised. Circumstance and hysteria, Ambrose said sharply. No court in Virginia enjoys reopening a scandal buried 14 years. Then we shall not begin with court. Gideon let that sink in. St. Luke's vestry meets on Thursday. 3 magistrates will attend regarding the glebe lease. So will Colonel Pryor, whose niece you hope to steer toward me before the war. So will the Carter brothers, who presently finance your warehouse notes. I shall place the matter before them all, with witnesses, unless your confession reaches Ashdown by Wednesday night. Ambrose rose despite his gout, fury draining the color from his face. You would drag your own blood through public filth for a woman who was never fit to stand in your hall? Gideon heard the sentence, and something old inside him died without regret. She stands there now, he said quietly. And you, sir, never were. He left Rosebank before he trusted himself to remain in a room with the man alive. What followed proved that public disgrace moves faster when it has spent years waiting for a crack. Ambrose attempted first to intimidate, then to negotiate, then to insinuate that Eliza's memory made her unreliable and the boy's resemblance a sentimental convenience. Gideon answered by gathering people, not just papers. Mrs. Harrow had already remembered the old hush around Eliza's disappearance. A former groom recalled the closed carriage sent out under orders not entered in the usual book. Dr. Pembroke wrote plainly that long memory disruption of the sort Eliza exhibited was wholly consistent with traumatic injury. St. Luke's rector produced the original Bell family register. Alfred's birth month aligned like judgment itself. Most powerful of all, Eliza agreed to appear. Gideon had feared pressing her toward public strain while her mind still healed. But one evening, after hearing part of Mrs. Harrow's report from the corridor, she came into the library where Gideon sat over correspondence and said, "If men did this in public forms, then part of the answer must also be public." He looked up at her. "You owe no performance to the county." "No." She held his gaze with a steadiness that had become stronger each week. "But I owe something to the woman I was when I entered that carriage believing I mattered enough to be met honestly." In that moment, he saw what suffering had not managed to kill in her. Moral spine refined by hardship rather than flattened by it. The vestry meeting became, by county standards, a small apocalypse. The rooms smelled of damp wood and ink. Men who had come to discuss leases found themselves instead faced with a restored woman, a solemn boy, witnesses, and Gideon Hart speaking with the composure that only comes when grief has finally chosen its target. Ambrose attempted hauteur. It served him badly. The more exact Gideon became, the smaller his uncle's evasions sounded. When Eliza spoke, haltingly at first, then with growing clarity as memory and outrage steadied each other, the room changed allegiance in silence. People did not need every detail proved to know what sort of thing had happened. They only needed enough truth to let their private disgust rise into the open. Then Alfred lifted his sleeve because no one had told him not to. The pale crescent mark showed. One of the magistrates, an elderly man who had known Gideon since childhood, removed his spectacles and said, almost to himself, "Good God." From there, the structure collapsed swiftly. Ambrose denied intent to murder. Gideon did not need murder for victory. Fraud, concealment, misappropriated papers, and reputational injury were enough to ruin a man already stretched by debt. Within 10 days, the Carter brothers froze his notes. Rosebank's creditors turned cautious, and 2 long silent servants found their consciences at last. By April, Ambrose Hart had become what old families fear most. Not wicked in rumor, but embarrassing in evidence. Yet justice did not arrive cleanly. Eliza's restoration was not simply a matter of standing in better rooms. She had to relearn herself, while every county eye tried to decide whether she was a wronged woman, an inconvenient claimant, or an object lesson in what happens when rank loves beneath itself. Alfred had to endure sudden grooming, tutors, stares, and the social awkwardness of being treated as both miracle and threat. Gideon had to confront the fact that rescuing them now did not repay what his younger weakness had failed to prevent. One night, he found Eliza in the schoolroom after Alfred had gone to bed, holding one of the new copybooks as if it frightened her. "I do not know how to belong here," she said. He answered with equal honesty, "Neither do I, and it is my house." She almost smiled. She sat by the window while April rain moved over the dark lawns. "Sometimes I remember enough to feel furious. Sometimes I remember less and only feel tired. Sometimes I look at Alfred and think I should be grateful we are alive. And then I hate gratitude, because it seems to ask too little of what was stolen." Gideon crossed the room slowly. "You are not required to make your suffering sound edifying." Her eyes lifted to him. "No? No." She laughed once under her breath, and there was the old Eliza at last. Older, damaged, sharper, but unmistakable. That is the most useful thing any gentleman has ever said to me. He knelt before her chair then, not from romance, though romance was there, but from a kind of moral correction. I loved you badly, he said, not because I loved too little, because I believed too long that defiance inside my own heart was a substitute for action in the world. It was not. I thought hating their values privately made me different enough from them. Meanwhile, you paid the cost. Her face changed with pain and tenderness together. You were young, she said. So was Ambrose once. That is not the same. No. He took a breath. But I will not ask youth to excuse what only courage could have prevented. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she placed her hand against his cheek with such gentleness that it felt almost unbearable. Do better with what remains, she said. That became the shape of their reconciliation. Not instant reunion, something slower and more adult. Gideon did better with what remained. He had Alfred formally acknowledged through parish and county record before midsummer, not waiting for every whisper to die, because whispers never do. He revised Ashdown's inheritance papers, naming the boy his lawful issue upon sworn testimony and supporting affidavits, then set aside independent provision for Eliza in her own right, whether she married him or not. That clause astonished half the county. He also asked Eliza, with the full dignity he should have given her in youth, whether she wished to marry him now that truth had been restored. She made him wait 3 days. Then, standing in the orchard, where the old lantern hooks still rusted on the branches, she told him plainly that she would not return as a rescued ghost fitted back into his life, but as the mother of his son, and the woman who had survived his family's violence without their permission. That is precisely the woman I ask for, Gideon said. Their wedding was small. Alfred stood beside Gideon in a blue coat and tried very hard not to look overwhelmed. Eliza wore cream muslin with the old green ribbon worked into her hair. When the vows were spoken at St. Luke's, more people attended than propriety required and fewer than curiosity desired. That suited Gideon perfectly. Ambrose did not come. By autumn, he had sold Rosebank under pressure and removed to a smaller property near Norfolk, still protesting that younger generations mistake discipline for cruelty. Few listened with the old patience. Ashdown altered slowly after the marriage, as houses do when truth enters not as slogan but as daily arrangement. Eliza took charge of the household accounts by degrees. First, because she wished to understand the machinery by which great rooms are maintained. Later, because she proved better than Gideon at noticing the quiet leakages of waste and condescension old estates call custom. She ordered wages reviewed for the women who spun and sewed for the house, expanded the physic garden, and turned one disused side room into a school chamber for younger servants' children during the cold months. It made her what she had always been capable of becoming once survival stopped consuming every hour. Alfred grew taller, less wary, and occasionally impossible. He argued with tutors, climbed where forbidden, asked questions about law, war, and lineage that forced adults into embarrassing honesty. Once, at table, after hearing 2 neighbors discuss honorable family descent, he said, "If descent is honorable, why were so many adults afraid of mine?" Mrs. Harrow choked on her tea. Gideon laughed aloud. Eliza, after a startled pause, laughed too. Years later, county people would still tell the story, badly, as they tell all stories that expose the failures of the powerful. That was the county's way of protecting itself from the full accusation embedded in the truth. But the truth was simpler and harder. A powerful family had tried to erase a poor woman because her existence complicated inheritance. A young man had mistaken private devotion for public courage. A child had been born into obscurity so that old men might sleep inside the comfort of orderly ledgers. And yet, the woman lived. The child endured. The man who once failed them learned at last that love without action is often only vanity wearing tenderness as a disguise. When Alfred was formally presented at 17 before the county as heir to Ashdown, he stood straight in a dark coat beside his mother and father while the clerk entered his name into the register. The old birthmark showed faintly at his cuff. Eliza's hand rested light but steady on his arm. Gideon looked at them both and felt no triumph, only the deep, stern peace of something set right after too much theft. Truth had not returned the lost years. It had forced the living to stop organizing themselves around a lie, and in that harder order, under a sky still full of history's unfinished weather, Eliza Hart took back her name. Alfred Hart took his place openly, and the house that once conspired to hide them was made at last to bear witness instead.